and perhaps even beautiful, but the deep shadows lend the place a forbidding air, which is echoed by the severe lines of the palazzo itself. The building faces the lake, and is fronted by tall windows through which silk curtains are visible. The east wing was once a banqueting hall, but now functions as a conference room. At its center, beneath a heavy Art Deco chandelier, is a long table bearing a Bugatti bronze of a panther. At first glance, the 12 men sitting around the table look ordinary enough. Successful, judging from their quietly expensive clothes. Most are in their late 50s or early 60s, with the kind of faces that you instantly forget. There is an unblinking watchfulness about these men, however, which is not ordinary. The morning passes in discussion, which is conducted in Russian and English, the languages common to all those present. Then a light lunch, antipasti, lake trout, chilled Vernaccia wine, fresh figs and apricots, is served on the terrace. Afterwards the 12 men pour themselves coffee, contemplate the breeze-ruffled expanse of the lake, and pace the garden. There are no security people, because at this level of secrecy, security people themselves become a risk. Before long the men have returned to their places in the shadowed conference room. The day's agenda is simply headed Europe. The first speaker is an ageless, darkly tanned figure with deep-set eyes. He looks around him. This morning, gentlemen, we discussed Europe's political and economic future. We talked, in particular, about the flow of capital, and how this can best be controlled. This afternoon I want to speak to you about a different economy. The room darkens, and the 12 turn to face the screen on the room's north wall showing an image of a Mediterranean port, of container ships and ship-to-shore gantry cranes. Palermo, gentlemen, today the principal point of entry for cocaine into Europe. The result of a strategic alliance between the Mexican drug cartels and the Sicilian mafia. Aren't the Sicilians a spent force? Asks a heavy-set man to his left. I was under the impression that the mainland syndicates ran the drugs trade these days. That used to be the case. Until 18 months ago the cartels dealt principally with the 'Ndrangheta, from the southern Italian region of Calabria. But in recent months a war has broken out between the Calabrians and a resurgent Sicilian clan, the Greci. A face appears on the screen. The dark eyes coldly watchful. The mouth a steel trap. Salvatore Greco has dedicated his life to resurrecting the influence of his family, which lost its place in the Cosa Nostra power structure in the 1990s, following the murder of Salvatore's father by a member of the rival Matteo family. A quarter of a century later Salvatore has hunted down and killed all of the surviving Mattei. The Greci, and their associates the Mazzini, are the richest, most powerful, and most feared of the Sicilian clans. Salvatore is known to have personally murdered at least 60 people, and to have ordered the deaths of hundreds more. Today, at 55 years of age, his hold over Palermo and its drug trade is absolute. His enterprises, worldwide, turn over some $20 to $30 billion. Gentlemen, he's practically one of us. A faint ripple of amusement, or something approximating to it, runs around the room. The problem with Salvatore Greco is not his predilection for torture and murder, he continues. When mafiosi kill mafiosi, it's like a self-cleaning oven. But recently he has started ordering the assassination of members of the establishment. To date, his tally is 2 judges and 4 senior magistrates, all killed by car bombs, and an investigative journalist, who was gunned down last month outside her apartment. The journalist was pregnant at the time of her death. The child did not survive. He pauses, and raises his glance to the screen with the image of the dead woman spread-eagled on the pavement in a pool of blood. Needless to say, it has not been possible to directly implicate Greco in any of these crimes. Police have been bribed or threatened, witnesses intimidated. The code of silence, or omerta, prevails. The man is, to all intents and purposes, untouchable. A month ago I sent an intermediary to arrange a meeting with him, as I felt that we needed to reach some sort of accommodation. His activities in this corner of Europe have become so excessive that they threaten to impact on our own interests. Greco's response was immediate. The following day I received a sealed package. The image on the screen changes. It contained, as you can see, my associate's eyes, ears and tongue. The message was clear. No meeting. No discussion. The men around the table regard the grisly tableau for a moment, then return their gaze to the speaker. Gentlemen, I think we need to take an executive decision concerning Salvatore Greco. He is a dangerously uncontrollable force, and beyond the reach of the law. His criminal activities, and the social havoc they entail, threaten the stability of the Mediterranean sector. I propose that we remove him from the game, permanently. Rising from his chair, the speaker makes his way to a side table, returning with an antique lacquered box. Taking out a black velvet drawstring bag, he pours its contents on the table in front of him. 24 small ivory fish, 12 of them aged to a smooth yellow, 12 of them stained a dark blood red. Each man receives a contrasting pair of fish. The velvet bag makes its way around the table counterclockwise. When it has made a full revolution, it is passed to the man who proposed the vote. Once again, the contents of the bag are poured onto the dimly gleaming surface of the table. 12 red fish. A unanimous sentence of death. It's evening, a fortnight later, and Villanelle is sitting at an outside table at La Jasmine, a private members' club in Paris's 16th arrondissement. From the east comes the murmur of traffic on the boulevard Suchet, to the west is the Bois de Boulogne and the Outwheel racecourse. The club's garden is bordered by a trellis hung with blossoming jasmine whose scent infuses the warm air. Most of the other tables are occupied, but conversation is muted. The light fades, the night awaits. Villanelle takes a long sip of her Grey Goose vodka martini, and discreetly surveys the surroundings, particularly noting the couple at the next table. Both are in their mid-20s, he elegantly disheveled, she cat-like and exquisite. Are they brother and sister? Professional colleagues? Lovers? Definitely not brother and sister, Villanelle decides. There's a tension between them, a complicity, that's anything but familial. They're certainly rich, though. Her silk sweater, for example, its dark gold matching her eyes. Not new, but definitely Chanel. And they're drinking vintage Taittinger, which doesn't come cheap at La Jasmine. Catching Villanelle's eye, the man raises his champagne flute a centimeter or two. He murmurs to his companion, who fixes her with a cool, assessing stare. Would you like to join us? She asks. It's a challenge, as much as an invitation. Villanelle stares back, unblinking. A breeze shivers the scented air. It's not compulsory, says the man, his wry smile at odds with the calm of his gaze. Villanelle stands, lifts her glass. I'd love to join you. I was expecting a friend, but she must have been held up. In that case. The man rises to his feet. I'm Olivier. And this is Nika. Villanelle. The conversation unfolds conventionally enough. Olivier, she learns, has recently launched a career as an art dealer. Nika intermittently works as an actress. They are not related, nor on closer inspection do they give the impression of being lovers. Even so, there is something subtly erotic in their complicity, and the way they've drawn her into their orbit. I'm a day trader, Villanelle tells them. Currencies, interest rate futures, all that. With satisfaction, she notes the immediate dimming of interest in their eyes. She can, if necessary, talk for hours about day trading, but they don't want to know. Instead, Villanelle describes the sunlit first-floor flat in Versailles from which she works. It doesn't exist, but she can picture it down to the ironwork scrolls on the balcony and the faded Persian rug on the floor. Her cover story is perfect now, and deception, as always, affords her a rush of pleasure. We love your name, and your eyes, and your hair, and most of all we love your shoes, says Nika. Villanelle laughs, and flexes her feet in her strappy satin Louboutins. Catching Olivier's eye, she deliberately mirrors his languid posture. She imagines his hands moving knowledgeably and possessively over her. He would see her, she guesses, as a beautiful, collectible object. He would think himself in control. What's funny? Asks Nika, tilting her head and lighting a cigarette. You are, says Villanelle. How would it be, she wonders, to lose herself in that golden gaze? To feel that smoky mouth on hers? She's enjoying herself now. She knows that both Olivier and Nika want her. They think that they're playing her, and Villanelle will go on letting them think so. It will be amusing to manipulate them, to see how far they will go. I have a suggestion, says Olivier, and at that moment the phone in Villanelle's bag begins to blink. A one-word text, deflect. She stands, her expression blank. She glances at Nika and Olivier, but in her mind they no longer exist. She's out of there without a word, and in less than a minute is swinging into a northbound stream of traffic on her Vespa. It's 3 years now since she first met the man who sent her the text. The man who, to this day, she knows only as Konstantin. Her circumstances, then, were very different. Her name was Oksana Vorontsova, and she was officially registered as a student of French and linguistics at the University of Perm, in central Russia. In 6 months' time she was due to sit her finals. It was unlikely, however, that she would ever walk into the university's examination hall as, since the previous autumn, she'd been unavoidably detained elsewhere. Specifically, in the Dobryanka Women's Remand Center in the Ural Mountains. Accused of murder. It's a short drive, perhaps 5 minutes, from La Jasmine de Villanelle's apartment near the Porte de Passy. The 1930s building is large, anonymous and quiet, with a well-secured underground garage. After parking the Vespa alongside her car, a fast and anonymous silver-gray Audi TT Roadster, Villanelle takes the lift to the 6th floor and ascends the short flight of stairs to her rooftop apartment. The front door, although faced with the same paneling as the others in the building, is of reinforced steel, and the electronic locking system is custom-made. Inside, the apartment is comfortable and spacious, even a little shabby. Konstantin handed Villanelle the keys and title deeds a year ago. She has no idea who lived there before her, but the place was fully furnished when she moved in, and from the decades-old fixtures and fittings, she guesses it was someone elderly. Uninterested in decoration, she has left the apartment as she found it, with its faded sea green and French blue rooms, and its nondescript post-impressionist paintings. No one ever visits her here. Her professional meetings take place in cafes and public parks. Her sexual liaisons are mostly conducted in hotels, but if they were to do so, the apartment would bear out her cover story in every detail. In the study, her computer, a top-of-the-range wafer of stainless steel, is protected by civilian security software that a halfway skilled hacker would quickly bypass. But a scan of its contents would reveal little more than the details of a successful day trading account, and the contents of the filing cabinet are similarly noncommittal. There is no music system. Music, for Villanelle, is at best a pointless irritation and at worst a lethal danger. In silence lies safety. Conditions at the remand center were unspeakable. The food was barely edible, the sanitation non-existent, and an icy, numbing wind from the Dobryanka River penetrated every cheerless corner of the institution. The slightest infraction of the rules resulted in a prolonged period of shiza, or solitary confinement. Oksana had been there for 3 months when she was ordered from her cell, marched without explanation to the prison courtyard, and ordered to climb into a battered all-terrain vehicle. 2 hours later, deep in the Perm Krai, the driver halted by a bridge over the frozen Chusovaya River, and wordlessly directed her to a low, prefabricated unit beside which a black 4-wheel drive Mercedes was parked. Inside the unit, there was just enough room for a table, 2 chairs, and a paraffin heater. A man in a heavy gray coat was sitting on one of the chairs, and to begin with, he just looked at her. Took in the threadbare prison uniform, the gaunt features, the posture of sullen defiance. Oksana Borisovna Vorontsova, he said eventually, consulting a printed folder on the table. Age, 23 years and 4 months. Accused of triple homicide, with multiple aggravating circumstances. She waited, staring out of the window at a small square of snowy forest. The man was ordinary enough looking, but she knew at a glance that this was not someone who could be manipulated. In a fortnight's time you will face trial, he continued. And you will be found guilty. There is no other conceivable outcome, and in theory you could be sentenced to death. At best you will spend the next 20 years of your life in a penal colony which will make Dobryanka look like a holiday resort. Her eyes remained blank. The man lit a cigarette, an imported brand, and offered her one. It would have bought her an extra helping of food for a week at the remand center, but Oksana refused it with a barely perceptible shake of the head. 3 men found dead. 1 with his throat slashed to the bone, 2 shot in the face. From beneath the table he took a flask and 2 cardboard cups. Poured slowly, so that the scent of strong tea infused the cold air. Nudged one of the cups towards her. The Brothers' Circle. One of the most violent and ruthless criminal organizations in Russia. He shook his head. What were you thinking, exactly, when you decided to execute 3 of their foot soldiers? She looked away, her expression disdainful. It's just as well the police found you before the brothers did, or I wouldn't be talking to you now. He dropped his cigarette end on the floor and trotted out. But I have to admit it was an efficient piece of work. Your father taught you well. She glanced at him again. Dark-haired, medium height, perhaps 40 years old. His gaze was level and his eyes were almost, but not quite, sympathetic. But you neglected the most important rule of all. You got caught. She took an exploratory sip of her tea. Reached across the table, took one of the cigarettes, and lit it. So who are you? Someone before whom you can speak freely, Oksana Borisovna. But first, please confirm the truth of the following. He took a folded sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. Your mother, who was Ukrainian, died when you were 7, of thyroid cancer, almost certainly as a consequence of her exposure to radiation following the Chernobyl reactor disaster 12 years earlier. 3 months after your mother's death, your father was posted to Chechnya, at which point you were taken into the temporary care of the Sakharov orphanage in Perm. You spent 18 months at the orphanage, during which time the staff noted your exceptional academic skills. They also identified other traits, including habitual bedwetting and a near-total inability to form relationships with other children. She exhaled, the smoke a long gray plume in the cold air, and touched the tip of her tongue to a ridge of scar tissue on her upper lip. The gesture, like the scar itself, was barely perceptible, but the man in the coat saw it, and noted it. When you were 10, your father was seconded again, this time to Dagestan. You returned to the Sakharov orphanage where, after 3 months, you were discovered setting fire to the dormitory block and transferred to the psychiatric unit of Municipal Hospital No. 4 in Perm. Against the advice of your therapist, who had diagnosed you as suffering from a sociopathic personality disorder, you were returned home to your father. The following year you commenced your studies at Industrialny District Secondary School. Here, once again, you won praise for your academic results, particularly for your language skills, and once again it was noted that you made no attempt to make friends or form relationships. Indeed, it's on the record that you were involved in, and suspected of instigating, a number of violent incidents. You did, however, form an attachment to your French teacher, a Miss Leonova, and became extremely agitated when you learned that she had been subjected to a serious sexual assault while waiting for a bus late at night. Her supposed assailant was arrested but later released for lack of evidence. 6 weeks later he was discovered in woodland near the Mulyanka River, incoherent with shock and blood loss. He had been castrated with a knife. Doctors succeeded in saving his life, but his attacker was never identified. At the time of these events you were approaching your 17th birthday. She trod out her cigarette on the floor. Is this leading anywhere? He almost smiled. I could mention the gold medal you won for pistol shooting at the University Games in Ekaterinburg. In your first year as an undergraduate. She shrugged, and he leaned forward in his chair. Just between ourselves. Those 3 men in the Pony Club, what did you feel when you killed them? She met his gaze, her expression blank. Okay, hypothetically. What might you have felt? At the time, I might have felt satisfaction at a job well done. Now? She shrugged again. Nothing. So for nothing, you are looking at 20 years in Berezniki, or somewhere similar? You brought me all the way here to tell me that? The truth, Oksana Borisovna, is that the world has a problem with people like you. Men or women who are born, as you were, without a conscience, or the ability to feel guilt. You represent a tiny fraction of the population at large, but without you. He lit another cigarette, and sat back in his chair. Without predators, people who can think the unthinkable, and act without fear or hesitation, the world stands still. You are an evolutionary necessity. There was a long silence. His words confirmed what she had always known, even at her lowest ebb, that she was different, that she was special, that she was born to soar. She stared through the window at the waiting vehicle, and the guards stamping their feet in the snow. Again, the tip of her tongue momentarily probed her upper lip. So what do you want from me? She asked. Constantine told her, sparing no detail of what was to come. And listening to him, it was as if everything in her life had led to that moment. Her expression never flickered, but the thrill that ripped through her was as avid as hunger. Over Paris, the light is fading. From a drawer in the desk in her study, Villanelle takes a new boxed Apple laptop, and unpacks it. Soon she is connected to a Gmail account and is opening a message whose subject heading is Jeff and Sarah, holiday pics. There are 2 paragraphs of text and a dozen JPEG images of a couple exploring tourist sites in and around Cairo. Hi all. We've had the best time ever. Pyramid's amazing, and Sarah rode a camel, see attached. Pics. Back on Sunday, landing 7.42, should be home by 9.45. Best wishes, Jeff. P.S. Please note Sarah's new email sprice88307@gmail.com. Ignoring the letters and words, Villanelle extracts the figures. These make up a one-time password, which enables her to access the compressed data embedded in the innocent-looking JPEG images? She remembers the words of the Indian systems designer who taught her covert communication. Encrypted messages are all very well, but even if they're completely unbreakable, they attract attention. Much better to ensure that no one suspects the existence of the message in the first place. She turns to the photographs. Because they're highly detailed, with excellent resolution, they can carry a substantial data payload. 10 minutes later, she has extracted all of the concealed text, which she combines into a single document. A second email headed Steve's Mobile has a briefer message, just a single phone number, and 6 JPEG images of an amateur football game. Villanelle repeats the earlier process, but this time extracts a series of photographic portraits. They are all of the same man. His eyes are dark, almost black, and the set of his mouth is hard. Villanelle stares at the pictures. She has never seen the man before, but there's something in his face that she recognizes. A kind of emptiness. It takes her a moment to remember where she's seen that look before. In the mirror. In her own eyes. The text document is headed Salvatore Greco. One of the unique attributes that recommended Villanelle to her present employers was her photographic memory. It takes her 30 minutes to read the Greco file, and when she has finished, she can recall every page as if she were holding it in front of her. Culled from police files, surveillance logs, court records, and informers' statements, it is an exhaustive personal portrait. All things considered, though, it is frustratingly brief. A timeline of Greco's career to date. An FBI psychological profile. A breakdown, in large part hypothetical, of his domestic situation, personal habits, and sexual proclivities. A list of properties held in his name. An analysis of his known security arrangements. The portrait that emerges is of a man of austere tastes. Pathologically averse to public attention, he is extremely skilled at avoiding it, even in an era of mass communication. At the same time, his power stems in large part from his reputation. In a region of the world where torture and murder are routine, Greco's ferocity sets him apart. Anyone who dares to stand in his way or question his authority is eliminated, usually with spectacular cruelty. Rivals have seen their entire families shot, informers discovered with their throats slashed and their tongues drawn out through the gaping wounds. Villanelle looks out over the city. To the left, the Eiffel Tower is silhouetted against the evening sky. To the right is the dark mass of the Tour Montparnasse. She considers Greco. Sets his personal refinement against the Baroque horror of his actions and commissions. Is there any way she can turn this contradiction to her advantage? She rereads the document file, scanning each sentence for a possible entree. Greco's principal residence, a farmhouse in a hill village outside Palermo, is a fortress. His family lives there, protected by a loyal and vigilant team of armed bodyguards. His wife, Caligera, rarely leaves home. His only daughter, Valentina, lives in a neighboring village, where she is married to the oldest son of her father's consigliere. The region has its own dialect and a history of obdurate hostility to outsiders. Those whom Greco wishes to meet, allied clan members, prospective associates, his tailor, his barber, are invited to the farmhouse, where they are searched and, if necessary, disarmed. When Greco leaves home to visit his mistress in Palermo, he is invariably accompanied by an armed driver and at least 2 bodyguards. There appears to be no predictable pattern to these visits. One document in particular, though, interests Villanelle. It's a 5-year-old press cutting from the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera reporting a near-fatal accident sustained by one of the paper's own journalists in Rome. According to Bruno De Santis, I was coming out of a restaurant in Trastevere when a car came racing towards me on the wrong side of the street. The next thing I knew, I was in hospital, lucky to be alive. De Santis' none too subtle suggestion is that this attempt on his life is the consequence of a piece he wrote for the Corriere a month earlier, about a young Sicilian soprano named Franca Farfaglia. In the piece, he criticized Farfaglia for having accepted a donation towards her studies at the La Scala Theatre Academy in Milan from Salvatore Greco, the notorious organized crime boss. It is a brave and perhaps foolhardy piece of journalism, but Villanelle is not interested in De Santis. Instead, she wonders what inspired Greco's generosity towards Farfaglia, not that he couldn't afford an infinity of such gestures. Was it a love of opera, the wish to help a talented local girl to achieve her potential, or an altogether more basic desire? An internet search produces a wealth of images of Farfaglia. Commanding in appearance, with proud, severe features, she looks older than her 26 years. Several of the images reappear on the singer's own website, where there's a history of her career to date, a selection of performance reviews, and her schedule for the next few months. Scrolling through the engagements, Villanelle pauses. Her eyes narrow, and she touches a fingertip to the scar on her lip. Then, clicking on the hyperlink, she brings up the website of the Teatro Massimo in Palermo. Oksana's training took the best part of a year. The worst came first. 6 weeks of fitness training and unarmed combat on lonely, wind-scoured stretch of the Essex coast. She arrived in early December. The instructor was a former special boat service instructor named Frank, a naughty, taciturn figure of about 60, with a gaze as cold as the North Sea. His habitual get-up, worn in all weathers, was a faded cotton tracksuit and a pair of old tennis shoes. Frank was merciless. Oksana was underweight and in poor condition following her months in the Dobrianka Remand Center, and for the first fortnight the interminable runs across the marshes, with a sleet whipping at her face and the greasy coastal mud sucking at her boots, were torture. Determination kept her going. Anything, even death from exposure on the mudflats, was better than returning to the Russian penal system. Frank didn't know who she was, and didn't care. His brief was simply to bring her to combat readiness. For the duration of the course she lived in an unheated Nissen hut on a mud and shingle island linked to the mainland by a quarter-mile long causeway. During the Cold War, the place had been an early warning station, and something of its grim, apocalyptic purpose lingered. On the first night Oksana was so cold she couldn't sleep, but from then on exhaustion took its toll, and she was wrapped in her single blanket and dead to the world by 9 p.m. Frank kicked the corrugated iron door open every morning at 4 a.m. before tossing her the day's rations, usually a plastic canteen of water and a couple of tins of processed meat and vegetables, and leaving her to pull on her t-shirt, combat trousers and boots, invariably still sodden from the day before. For 2 hours they ran repeated circuits of the island, either across the oozing gray mudflats or along the icy tide line, before returning to the Nissen hut to brew tea and heat up a mess tin of rations on a small hexamine stove. By sunrise, they would be outside again, pounding the mudflats until Oksana was vomiting with fatigue. In the afternoons, as the darkness closed in, they worked on hand-to-hand combat. Over the years Frank had taken elements of jiu-jitsu, street fighting and other techniques and refined them into a single discipline. The emphasis was on improvisation and speed, and practice sessions were often conducted knee-deep in the sea, with the mud and shingle shifting treacherously beneath their feet. Realizing that her English was poor, Frank taught by physical example. Oksana thought she knew a thing or two about fighting, having learned the basics of the Sistema Spetsnaz from her father, but Frank seemed to anticipate every move she attempted, deflecting her blows with casual ease before pitching her, yet again, into the icy seawater. Oksana didn't think she'd ever hated anyone as much as she hated the ex-SBS instructor. No one, even in the Perm orphanage or the Dobryanka remand unit, had so systematically belittled and humiliated her. Hatred became a simmering rage. She was Oksana Borisovna Vorontsova, and she lived by rules that few would even begin to understand. She would beat this Angliski Oblyadak, this donkey fucker, if it killed her. Late one afternoon in the final week, they were circling each other in the incoming tide. Frank had a Gerber knife with an 8-inch blade. Oksana was unarmed. Frank moved first, swinging the oxidized blade so close to her face that she felt the breeze of its passing, and in response she ducked under his knife arm and hammered a short arm punch into his ribs. It stopped him for a second, and by the time the Gerber came slicing back, she was out of reach. They danced back and forth, and Frank lunged for her chest. Her body outraced her brain. Half turning, she grabbed his wrist, wrenched him in the direction to which he was already committed, and booted his legs from under him. As Frank fell backwards into the water, arms flailing, she was already lifting her knee to stamp his knife hand into the shingle, control the weapon, then the man her father had always told her, and as the instructor involuntarily released the Gerber, fell forwards to pin him underwater. Straddling him, she forced his head back with the palm of her hand, and watched the agonized working of his face as he began to drown. It was interesting, fascinating, even, but she wanted him alive to acknowledge her triumph. So she dragged him onto the shore, where he rolled onto his side and retched up gouts of seawater. When he finally opened his eyes, she was holding the point of the Gerber knife to his throat. Meeting her eyes, he nodded in submission. A week later, Konstantin came to collect her, looking her up and down with quiet approval as she waited, rucksack slung loosely over one shoulder, on the muddy track leading to the causeway. "You look good," he said, his flat gaze taking in her newly confident stance and wind-burned, salt-blistered features. "You know she's a fucking psycho," said Frank. "Nobody's perfect," said Konstantin. 2 days later, Oksana flew to Germany for 3 weeks escape and evasion training at the Mountain Warfare School in Mittenwald. She was attached to a NATO Special Forces cadre, and her cover story was that she was on secondment from a Russian Interior Ministry counterterrorism unit. On the second night, while dug into deep snow, she felt stealthy fingers at the zip of her bivy bag. A silent but furious fight erupted in the darkness, and the following day 2 of the NATO soldiers were helicoptered off the mountain, one with a severed forearm tendon, the other with a stab wound through the palm of his hand. After that, no one bothered her. Immediately after Mittenwald, she was flown to a U.S. Army facility in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where she was put through an advanced resistance to interrogation program. This was calculatedly nightmarish, and designed to induce maximal stress and anxiety in its subjects. Shortly after her arrival, Oksana was stripped naked by her male guards and marched to a brightly lit, windowless cell, empty except for a closed-circuit camera mounted high on one wall. Time passed, hour after endless hour, but she was given only water, and without toilet facilities was forced to use the floor. Before long the cell stank, and her stomach was twisting with hunger. If she tried to sleep, the cell would reverberate with white noise, or with electronic voices repeating meaningless phrases at ear-splitting volume. At the end of the second day, or it might have been the third, she was hooded, and led to another part of the building where she was questioned, in fluent Russian and for hours on end, by unseen interrogators. Between these sessions, in which she was offered food in exchange for information, she was forced to adopt agonizing and humiliating stress positions. Starved, sleep-deprived and severely disoriented, she drifted into a trance-like state, in which the boundaries between her senses blurred. She managed, nevertheless, to hang on to some vestigial sense of self, and to the knowledge that the experience would come to an end. However terrifying and degrading it turned out to be, it was preferable to life in the secure wing of a Ural Mountains penal colony. By the time the exercise was officially pronounced over, Oksana was beginning, in a deeply perverse way, to enjoy it. Further courses followed. A month of weapons familiarization at a camp to the south of Kiev, in Ukraine, followed by 3 more at a Russian sniper school. This was not the high-profile establishment outside Moscow where the Spetsnaz Alpha and Wimpel detachments trained, but a much more remote facility near Ekaterinburg, run by a private security company whose instructors asked no questions. Being back in Russia felt strange to Oksana, even under the false identity provided by Konstantin. Ekaterinburg, after all, was less than 200 miles from where she had grown up. It wasn't long, though, before the deception began to give her a certain heady satisfaction. Officially, Oksana Vorontsova no longer exists, Konstantin informed her. A certificate issued at Perm Regional Clinical Hospital indicates that she hanged herself in her cell at the Dobryanka Remand Center. District records show that she was buried at public expense in the Industrialny Cemetery. Trust me, no one misses her, and no one is looking for her. Severka Urban Sniper School was built around a deserted town. In Soviet times it had been home to a thriving community of scientists studying the effects of radiation exposure. Now it was a ghost town, peopled only by life-size target dummies, strategically situated behind plate glass windows and at the wheels of rusting, skeletal vehicles. It was an eerie place, silent except for the wind that whistled between its empty buildings. Oksana's basic training was with the standard-issue Dragunov. Soon, though, she graduated to the VSS, or Special Sniper Rifle. With its exceptionally lightweight and integral silencer, it was the ideal urban weapon. By the time she left Severka, she had fired thousands of rounds under a variety of operational conditions, and in less than a minute was able to arrive at a firing point. With the VSS in its polystyrene case, assemble the weapon, zero the sights, calculate wind speed and other vectors, and squeeze off a lethal head or body shot, one kill, in the words of her instructor, at a range of up to 400 meters. Oksana sensed herself changing, and the results pleased her. Her observational ability, sensory skills and reactive speeds had all been extraordinarily enhanced. Psychologically, she felt invulnerable, but then she had always known that she was different from those around her. She felt none of the things they felt. Where others would experience pain or horror, she knew only a frozen dispassion. She had learned to imitate the emotional responses of others, their fears, their uncertainties, their desperate need for affection, but she had never fully experienced them. She knew, however, that if she was to escape notice in the world, it was essential to wear a mask of normality, and to disguise the extent of her difference. She had learnt, very young, that people could be manipulated. Sex was useful in this regard. And Oksana acquired a voracious appetite. Not so much for the act itself, although this had its satisfactions, as for the thrill of pursuit and psychic domination. For lovers, she liked to choose authority figures. Her conquests had included school teachers of both genders, a Spetsnaz colleague of her father's, a young woman from a military academy in Kazan against whom she was competing in the university games, and most satisfying of all, the psychotherapist she'd been referred to for assessment in her first year at university. Oksana had never felt the slightest need to be liked, but it gave her profound satisfaction to be desired. To see the look in her conquest's eyes, that final melting of resistance, which told her the transfer of power was complete. Not that it was ever quite enough. Because for all its fierce excitement, that moment of submission invariably marked the end of Oksana's interest. The story was always the same, even with Yuliana, the psychotherapist. By yielding to Oksana, by surrendering her mystery, she made herself undesirable. And Oksana simply moved on, leaving the older woman bereft, her personal and professional self-esteem in tatters. After the sniper course, she learned about explosives and toxicology in Volgograd, surveillance in Berlin, advanced driving and lockpicking in London, and identity management, communications and coding in Paris. For Oksana, who had never left Russia before her appointment with Konstantin at the Chusovaya Bridge, the international traveling was dizzying. Each course was taught in the language of the country in question, testing her linguistic aptitude to the limit and, more often than not, leaving her mentally as well as physically drained. Throughout it all, patient and imperturbable on the sidelines, was Konstantin. He maintained a professional distance between himself and Oksana, but was sympathetic towards her on the handful of occasions when the pressure became too much, and she demanded, coldly, to be left alone. Take a day off, he told her on one occasion in London. Go and explore the city. And start thinking about your cover name. Oksana Vorontsova dead. By November, her training was almost over. She had been staying in a dingy one-star hotel in the Paris suburb of Belleville, and traveling every day to an anonymous office building in La Défense, where a young man of Indian origin was teaching her the finer points of steganography. The science of concealing secret information in computer files. On the final day of the course, Konstantin appeared, paid her hotel bill, and accompanied her to an apartment on the quai Voltaire, on the left bank,